So the Lethbridge Public Library acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The city of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Eden Robinson has matriarchal tendencies. She doesn't have a pressure cooker, but knows how to jar salmon. Her smoked salmon will likely not kill you. Her hobbies include shopping for the apocalypse, using vocabulary as a weapon, nominating cousins to council while they're out of town, chair yoga, looking up possible diseases or syndromes on the interwebs, perfecting gluten-free bannock, and playing mahjong. Be warned, she writes novels and tends to be cranky when interrupted. Eden is the author of 6 novels and collection of short stories, Traplines, which won the Wilfred Holby Prize in the United Kingdom. She's Isis, a 2-time she is also a 2-time Scotia Giller Prize finalist for her novels Monkey Beach and Son of a Trickster, with the former winning the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize and a nominee for the Governor General's Award for Fiction. Son of a Trickster was also a contender for the 2021 edition of Canada Reads. Her latest novel is in the final book in the Trickster trilogy is Return of a Trickster. So thanks, Eden, for joining us today. We're really excited.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's very windy in Lethbridge today. So we haven't all blown away yet, though. So for those of our listeners who haven't read the previous Trickster books, can you maybe give us like a brief synopsis of the series?
In the first book, we meet Jared Martin, and he lives in Kitimat. His mom is health sick, and his dad, he thinks, is the man who he thinks is his dad is from Ulster Bay. So they've moved to Kitimat for work, and they're going through a really, really rough patch. Like the paper mill just closed, his dad's going through health and addiction issues, his mom. So they're doing a lot of hustles to get by. And then his life starts to get strange, and we soon discover that's because, spoiler alert, he's the son of Wiget, the transforming raven. And things come to a head at the end of the novel with some otters and, the realization that his mother is a witch and Wiget is his father. So we start the second book, Trickster Drift, with Jared going to Vancouver to get into a medical sonography program. They have one in BCIT, and the next closest one is in SAIT. I think it's in Calgary. And he's looking like his childhood has been so chaotic and so filled with drama that he's looking for a quiet, normal life and a quiet job. So he's doing some upgrading because his physics and biology marks weren't high enough to get into the program. And when he gets to Vancouver, he discovers that he can't afford rent. So he moves in with his estranged aunt, Maeve, and he meets his extended urban family, and he's getting to know Wiget's sister, Joissons, who's called Georgina. And it turns out she's an ogress married into a clan of koi wolves. Koi wolves are a hybrid species that's just developed in the last couple of 100 years. So wolves and coyotes mated and created this hybrid. And one of his mother's exes is living in Vancouver, and when he found out that Jared was there, started to stalk him. So when things come to a head with the stalker, and then Jared's aunt reveals herself to be an ogress and threatens everyone he loves. So he, you know, with his trickster power, pulls them out of our universe and into a parallel universe where he's been before in the first book. And he's trapped in that universe with his aunt, who, being an ogress, she eats him a lot. So she kills him and resurrects him, kills him and resurrects him, until he finally gets away. So Return of the Trickster starts like 2 hours after Jared returns to our universe.
Perfect.
Yeah, it sounds kind of nuts when you say it out loud.
Once you read it, though.
Yeah, my poor editor was, you have to pitch to your sales and your marketing team, and she's like, how to summarize the book. There's an ogress. She wants to come back to this universe, so she's, yeah.
No, I really enjoyed the last part of it. I didn't want it to end, so.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. One thing when I was just sort of doing research for this, I was reading you kind of had a different ending, but then during the pandemic, things kind of changed that. So I just was sort of wondering like how the pandemic and everything, how it impacted you writing this last part of the trilogy.
In the before times, when
What's
everything,
that?
I wrote the first draft of Return of the Trickster in a very leisurely space, like a very calm, and it was so the draft itself was more of a meditation. It was very like a lot of quiet realizations. Each of the characters had their own arc. Um, Sophia was going around throwing money at everybody's problems. It was a very gentle story of healing. And when I talked to my editor, she was like, it's lovely, but a little boring. So we met in Toronto because I was a part of Canada Reads in 2020. And that was just before lockdown. So at the time, I was in Campbell River doing a residency. And I was staying in this lovely old house called the Haig Brown House. And if you know the works of Roderick Haig Brown, his house is north of Campbell River on 2 acres of lovely garden with the river on one side and a park on the other, where the deer come in every day and they try to push at the fence to get into the herb garden. They sort of wander around nibbling on things. Well, as a part of a writer in residency, you do class visits. So I was doing class visits for the North Island, and a part of that was going to university. So I went to this one class where one of the students had gone to get her teeth cleaned, and her dentist had gone to a conference where it turned out to be a super spreader event. So that was my very first call from a contact tracer saying, well, there's a possibility that you've been exposed to COVID. You need to quarantine for 2 weeks. And at that time, they were still rationing the COVID tests. So she said, if it becomes difficult to speak, like if you can't say more than one word at a time, then you call the hospital. If you're just having difficulty breathing, but you can still speak, don't call the hospital.
Oh, geez. So reassuring.
So I was alone. My coworkers would come and they'd bring me fresh food, but basically it was me in the house. And because I have horrible seasonal allergies and we were
Mm.
surrounded by garden, like my
Mhm.
nose was dripping, I was congested, and I was hot flashing. So I
Mhm.
didn't know if I was dying
Yeah,
or
every day.
because doing temperature readings when you're hot flashing is kind of useless.
Yeah.
Constantly like 39, 40. I was like,
Yeah.
oh my God. So, possibly, you know, dying alone in a house with, none of your family around puts you in a different headspace.
A little bit, yeah.
So the second draft of Return of the Trickster, everybody died. They all died gruesome, violent deaths. Like it
Oh.
was a slaughter from beginning to end. And Jared died on the very last page, like slowly bleeding out on the ground. Uh, so I turned that draft in late March. My term ended, so I took the ferry back up north, and I, had to self isolate quarantine again for 2 weeks because I, was just coming back to the community. So I knew that, and I brought all my food in, and it was a very different quarantine because I was in my own apartment, and I was
Mhm.
surrounded by family. Like my mom lives 2 blocks away, and my cousins would drop by with like fresh fish or crabs or clams, or yeah, I've got some gluten-free cousins who really bake well, so they would make me like tweed cakes and
Oh.
like the lemon poppy seed, just so in that mood. I tackled the third draft because my editor asked me if we could have some people survive. So it wasn't like the full restructuring of the first to the second draft. It was mostly a tackling of the last third where we were having a lot of the structural issues. So
Mhm.
the third draft is basically what you have now. And that's pretty typical for me. Um, there are tidier writers out there, like their process has them outlining beforehand. So they do their structural work before they start writing. I've never done well with that kind of process. I'm a cook with abandon kind of writer. It's a very messy process, so that means there's a lot of cleanup after. So so 3 drafts is about my average. I don't think there has been a book that's been less than 3 drafts. Like Monkey Beach was, God, that was at least 10 full drafts. So I think I burned through 3 editors. I just had no idea what a novel was. So, oh my goodness. Yeah, it was bananas.
Um, so what sources do you tap into for the supernatural aspects of the story?
Um, well, when I was growing up, I was a very emo kid, very goth in my sensibilities. So I loved horror and science fiction. So they formed the sort of template of what I like to read. And for the traditional supernatural elements, I grew up in my dad's community, so I know the highest law much better than the Helsik. But mom was really annoyed that the highest law were getting all the page space. She wanted one of my characters to be Helsik, so that's why Jared's half Helsik, half Trickster. And there are a lot of similarities. The Helsik Trickster is a lot more benign than we get. So I went with we get because he's a bit wilder. Um, because I'm from the coast, like we have a traditional copyright,
Mm.
and I tend to stay away from the copyrighted stories. And create my worlds within the stories that are in the public domain. Because if I venture into the ones that are covered and has the copyright, the payment for that is you have to throw a potlatch, and they're between 10 and 40,000.
Oh, wow.
And there's because I don't have a big enough traditional name, I would have to ask one of the chiefs of this where the story belonged to. I'd have to ask him to attach my business to his potlatch. So it would require a lot of money and a lot of negotiation. And it's a little too much. So stories that surround Weget are mostly in the public domain. So, and I learned all that when I was writing Monkey Beach. So I pulled those lessons for Trickster, and I knew the playground very well. So all the supernatural characters in the Trickster series are within the public domain. None of them are in any of the stories that are owned by people, clans, or communities. So, and then, some of the supernatural elements are from my brain. There's in the third book, there's a spirit octopus that eats souls, and his name is Bob. And yeah, that's I've always wanted to have like a Cthulhu type character running through my novel, and I thought it would be a good fit for the Trickster series. Like things like the flying head. There are other nations where they have flying heads, but not on the coast. And when I was writing the first book, I thought, what is the weirdest thing you could look out the window and see? Like if you're on the second floor of an apartment building, what would disturb you the most? A flying head.
Yeah, that would do it.
And I was also really interested in different cultures' concepts of time. So when I was playing with like the pocket universes, or the multiverse, or that's the little nerd moments that just thrill me. I just love, just like there's like a little section on trilobites, and I just like trilobites. I honestly don't know why. They're not the sexiest extinct fossil, but I just had a lot of fun writing that little section. The most like the because the universe was so populated, it was hard to add more to the third book. So I limited it to 2 new characters, and one of them, like my dad, was still with us when Son of a Trickster was published, and was very disappointed because in the Trickster universe, I hadn't taken the opportunity to tell a Bagwis story, a Wild Man of the Woods, a Sasquatch story. And I had already finished like the draft of Trickster Drift, so I added like a completely gratuitous Sasquatch scene to the third novel. So Chuck, or Charles Hucker, is Hugin, which means he doesn't eat people. And he is, he owns property in Whistler and snowboards. So I've had a lot of requests to have a book about Chuck and Weget in the 70s.
Yeah,
like,
I read that.
That's a lot of acid and mushrooms.
I'm picturing it. I'm seeing lots of like brown plaids and little mustache.
Well, there was the original scene where they meet, and that was originally all it was. But my editor said that, you can't introduce a character like Chuck and not use them. So that's why he comes back for the breakfast scene.
Nice. When you were writing, did you have it all planned out? Like, did you write your first one and you knew what you were gonna do, or were you
Lord,
sort of
no.
like, no?
No. I knew the end. I knew, that was always there um, because of the characters that were involved. It was always going to be a showdown between Jared and his aunt. They have two very different approaches to magic and life. But getting there was more of a journey than I was expecting. Yeah, I thought it was I first I thought it was a short story, but as the page count went up when I hit 400, I realized it was probably a novel. And then halfway through editing the first draft, I realized it was two novels. And then when I got halfway through editing the second novel, I realized it was actually a trilogy. I still hadn't introduced like the final conflict, and the main antagonist was still off stage. So I was like, okay, it's a trilogy. But I know that it's just a trilogy now because like when I wake up, there's like I'm not thinking about it first thing in the morning, and I'm not thinking about it like when I go to sleep at night. So it's that's usually when I can tell that you know a project is over. So yeah, I remember waking up and I was thinking of something else and went, oh, okay, so it's just a trilogy then. Um, so that's part of it is experience, and part of it is just knowing my own process. And I think that, let's see, yeah, I still haven't landed on the next book.
No.
No, no. I have many ideas for what I want to write. And I was working on a trashy band council romance.
Oh,
Be-
that'd be good.
That's what I was actually intending to write before I took this little detour into the Trickster world. Um, and the difficulty of that was that I had not worked with multiple narrators before. Every single book that I had written up to that point had
Yeah.
was told from a singular point of view. So it was either first person or third person limited. Like you were either in someone's head or on their shoulder. Um, and the trashy band council romance demands multiple viewpoints. So people are going to talk about the affair, they're going to have opinions about the affair, they're going to argue about the affair. And then it kind of spreads out into, well, I remember her grandmother had an affair. So it's like it's not something that I have a lot of experience with. So I started reading novels that had multiple narrators to try take apart what they were doing to make, and what different techniques did. And so I'm playing with that a bit in the third novel, because Jared has, accepted his tricksterness. And now that he's more attuned, he can speak as magical beings speak to each other, mind to mind. And he's just learning to navigate that. And when I first started writing the Trickster series, like it was from Wiegand's point of view, it was from Maggie's point of view, but didn't really go anywhere until I found Jared.
Mhm.
So it was nice to be able to go back into Wiegand's world and Maggie's world. And by the third draft, I had figured out how to make the voices unique to that person. Only that person. You could tell from the tone and the vocabulary choice, like who is speaking. So that was so much fun. Like that was really exciting. So I think I'm now ready for a multi-voice novel. And
Nice.
that was I'm
Sounds
not
really good.
that was a hoot. Yeah, there's a bunch of like there's yeah, if I stick to like a book every 5 years.
Hey.
It's like doing the math. It's like, oh my goodness, I don't think I'll be able to finish everything I want to write. uh, but this spring and summer is all about dealing with uh, like I finally found a medication that works on my arthritises.
Mm,
So that's wonderful. I'm very
mhm,
grateful. Like it's brought my
mhm,
inflammation levels down. It's brought the pain levels down. So now, like one of the arthritises froze my shoulders and my knees.
no.
So, like when you have inflammation that freezes your shoulders, the muscles harden around it,
Mhm,
and you have to break them up to get your range of motion back.
mhm,
So I we did my shoulders first. I couldn't do that and my knees, so I just left my knees. But
mhm,
I have range of motion back. But it took a lot of if you've ever had a deep tissue massage,
mhm.
it's a little more intense than that. Like they go in and kind of manipulate the muscle until the scar tissue breaks up.
Oh.
And then you do the tens, you do the
Mhm,
heat, you do the cold, and then you do your exercises. You do your range of motion exercises. So it was a process that lasted like a couple of months. Like there was a, you know, and in the beginning it was a little intimidating because I knew just how painful it was going to be,
mhm,
and the next few days would feel a bit bruised. But then it felt so good to have the blood flow back and to be able to move again.
mhm.
So I know that it's just the start that's going to be, intimidating. But once I get over that, like once like they dig into my knees, like one of my uncles has the same kind of arthritis that I do, and he's not one for messing around. Like he's like, you just take a dictionary and you tenderize it. I was like,
Oh,
yeah.
not doctor recommended.
I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna let the registered masseuse deal with the scar tissue. I'm not that hardcore.
Yeah.
I'm so looking forward to being able to do stairs normally. That would be amazing. And then I've signed up for Heisla language courses. Uh,
Mm,
it starts in October and goes for a year. Like some of my cousins have done it. And I'm really horrible like learning other languages. It's um, like my dad was multilingual. He spoke like five different languages, and he just picked them up very easily. So he was puzzled by how I could not get highs line. It was like, okay. So I think like the course looks like it's designed for people like me, adult learners coming back to it after a long time. So
nice.
yeah, yeah. And I'm, not doing it for marks or anything. And that's
Exactly. The pressure's off.
the pressure is off. It's I would like to graduate from kindergarten Heisla. Mom was like, well, if you're learning Heisla, then, why aren't you learning Celtic? It's like, no.
One at a time.
Like they're from the same language family. Like, so like smoked dried fish is in Heisla is uh Delos, and in Celtic it's Deleuze. So you have like vocabulary that's so close. It's just, it would just be, it was like, no, I wouldn't speak either of them by the end of it. So we've compromised, and she's teaching me Celtic swear words.
Oh, that's the important part. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Celtic swear words are gloriously graphic.
Hey, that makes it better. Before we do your little reading, I just was wondering, like you've had so much success, with the Trickster series. How does that, like, in being on Canada Reads and the awards you've won, how does that put pressure on your, like, do you find that it puts pressure on your writing, or?
I think my experience with Monkey Beach was really helpful. Like, Monkey Beach had a lot of attention, and it was nominated for a lot of things, and it was very popular. And the pressure for the second book was excruciating. And, I was trying to write like a book that was, sort of a duplicate of Monkey Beach, and I wasn't finding it very interesting. It wasn't very challenging. So the thing that I wanted to write was blood sports. And my poor little blood sports, the unloved child of my oeuvre was my quit smoking book. So like up at that point I was about a 2-packer, sometimes
Oh, wow.
3. Yeah, very light smoker. Yeah. I could go up to 5.
Oh my goodness.
Like when I was writing Monkey Beach, I was writing it on like one of those little apples. It was like jelly colored. It was it wasn't burnt orange and white. And I had to bring it in twice while I was writing Monkey Beach because the tar from the cigarettes stopped the fan from spinning.
Oh, wow.
So halfway through writing blood sports, I had to quit smoking because my doctors were talking oxygen tanks, and I thought it would be really hard to flirt with an oxygen tank.
That's sexy.
So I went cold turkey. Like it
wow.
was my 17th try. And I knew my day job at that point was I was working for the Treaty Archives, and it was in the resource building with fisheries and public works and the mail. And so it was, it was all cousins. And I knew that I was cranky because sometimes they would run up and throw cigarettes over the cubicle wall.
Oh, geez.
But you can see the point in the novel where I quit smoking because there's the 40-page torture scene. The more I suffered, the more my characters suffered. So, bless my family. They have bought every single book that I've published. None of them have made it through blood sports.
Oh.
They hit the torture scene and go, "We love you, but
not for us.
We're just not finishing this." So that extreme experience where you have like one book that's very successful, and then one book that kind of sinks out of sight. It tempered like all my like sort of roller coaster feelings around publishing it. Like, your book's gonna do what it's gonna do. If it's successful, it's successful. If it's not, you learn something. And so coming into the Trickster series, I was really telling the story to cousins. Like that was my imagined audience, because I have about 500 cousins who are hardcore fans. So they'll buy everything. So I knew it would sell at least 500 copies.
Yeah. That's a big print run in Canada.
That's a huge print run.
Yeah.
So I knew it would do okay. And yeah, so when it started taking off, it was a bit of a shock. I didn't expect it to get the kind of attention that it got. And I had already finished the second book by the time the first book was published. So for the third book, I was mostly concerned with like I got a lot of grief for the way Monkey Beach ended. Traditionally, our stories don't end open. Like there is an expectation of resolution. So, inevitably people would phone me like at certain plot points, like when Mick died, when Mama O died, and then at the end I would get like the angriest call, like, I love open endings. Like, you, the reader, get to imagine, how
Yeah.
the story ends. So the trick with the Trickster series was to give enough closure that, because the people who've invested all this time in the series, uh, you know, that demands more of a resolution than I'm used to giving. So that was my concern going in. It's like, okay. And for the first draft, I wanted everybody to have a happy ending. So I gave everybody happy endings. Like they all came out and they were, all healed and in a better place. And yeah. So the third novel ties things up as much as I'm capable of tying things up.
I like that though. There's still like the element of, unknown, and you can kind of fill it in with how you saw the story, right? Because everybody reads so differently.
Yes, it's very subjective. The I the disappointment so far has been that Jared and Sarah didn't end up at the end of Return of the Trickster. I was like, well, I think they're on two very different journeys, because
Yeah.
Sarah is more interested in exploring magic, and Jared, that's as far as he's concerned, he's learned enough.
I think that makes it more relatable too, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not perfect, and like that's
Yeah.
life isn't perfect, right?
Yeah, they're it's just, they have a solid friendship, and they're
Yeah.
always going to talk, and they work through a lot of the things that trip them up the first time around, but they're not, yeah, yeah, I think I really liked, like, if I was going to write a fourth book, like the epilogue of The Return of the Trickster was where I would have gone. Um, but by that point, Jared was pretty well done. He had nothing left to say, and he didn't want to say anymore.
Yeah.
He was just, that was all the adventure he wanted. You know, any further books would have to be from a completely different viewpoint. So I think the Trickster check idea would be, yeah, because him and because we get Anita, we're the fighty res couple, so they were, breaking up all the time. So that would. Oh my goodness. Oops.
So are you good to read?
I'm good to read. I was just looking at the
Okay.
time going, I think I'll do a 5-minute.
Sounds good. And if anybody has any questions while Eden's reading, just pop them in the question and answer, and we can see if we can get to them at the end.
This is from the opening, chapter 1, Sloppy Dead. The IV dripped cold into Jared Martin's arm, a remarkably grounding sensation. Saline. He remembered the nurse telling him he was dehydrated and that he kept throwing up the water they gave him. Bile scorched the back of his throat. An unseen ambulance warbled, growing louder. The lights were achingly bright. The hospital mattress was firm against his back, and the pale curtains surrounding his bed were shut. Through these fabric walls, he could hear other patients in the Kitimat General Hospital emergency ward, murmuring with their families, friends, lovers. A scream cut through the quiet as electric doors swooshed open somewhere near, bringing the smell of rain, then closed. Voices shouted information and instructions at each other as a lone male voice howled, guttural. He shivered. Nausea hit again. Jared's stomach cramped. The nurse had given him a little cardboard container for his vomit, but it was full and pungent, reeking on the medical table. Jared slid off the bed. The floor was cold against his bare feet. He yanked off the clear tape that held the IV in place and carefully pulled out the needle. The other bed curtains were shut, but through the gaps he could see patients listening intently as another male voice joined the first. He made it out to the corridor where he watched two men fight free of the paramedics and the lone police officer to grapple with each other. A security guard ran past Jared as the men threw punches that landed with earnest thuds. Jared covered his mouth as he started to heave. He pushed open the heavy bathroom door and threw up into the toilet. Blood, bright red against the white enamel, diffused in tendrils in the water, copper in his mouth. The muscles in his throat clenched and released until he threw up again, this time a stew of blood and chunks. His stomach burned, a hot pain like accidentally swallowing a live coal. The searing intensified until it was as if he'd swallowed the whole barbecue pit. Oh God, Jared thought, I'm dying. He could hear police sirens in the distance. He hurled and could feel large fur masses working their way up his throat, blocking his breathing. Dizziness hit as he fought for air. He crawled towards the door, spewing strained sacks of flesh, bloody and self-contained. Shapes his biology class led him to guess were organs, a spleen maybe, a kidney. Jared tried to scream, but it came out as a gurgle as he puked again. He felt his intestine shift and then an intense urge to defecate. God, he thought, oh God, please. Jared? Not God, only the voice of his biological father we get. The transforming raven was speaking to him, as magical beings speak to one another, sharing thoughts. The insanity of the magic Jared had unleashed left him with no way to deny he was a trickster himself, that he was a part of the crazy, that his amateur dabbling had created the shitstorm that eventually landed him in a merge. Again. All his relationships changed now, except the rotten one he had with his bio dad. Normally, Jared would tell him to fuck right off, but his organs were running amok in the hospital bathroom, and he had no pride left. Please help me. You've pushed way past the limits of your magical ability, you lumbering dolt. Wiget thought at him. Stop blubbering and call your damn organs back to your body. I don't know how. Pretend it's a dream. Will your organs back into your body. Will your blood and guts to behave. You're the boss. Make them listen to you. He still couldn't breathe. The part of him that didn't want to admit he was something other than a regular human fought the part of him that wanted to stay alive at any cost. Fear metallic in his mouth, humming through his body, making him shake. He wanted to be whole. He wanted himself back together, and he fought through his own panic and finally felt a connection to the bits of him that had escaped. An awareness like knowing someone was near you in the dark. Like a film in reverse, his blood streamed back to him and disappeared when it touched his skin. The organs, naked, shiny, and slick, continued to roll across the industrial gray floor, while two of them splashed in the toilet like children in a kiddie pool. He touched the organs near him, and they tried to wiggle free, but were absorbed back into his body, where they fluttered beneath his skin and then went quiet.
Wow. Thanks, Eden.
Thank you. Yeah, like some of the first reviews for Son of a Trickster, like sort of itemized every time Jared threw up. I hadn't realized until that point. Continuing the Trickster tradition.
Wow. So we have a couple of questions.
Perfect.
The first one is from Luke. They write, as a marginalized writer, I really appreciate how subtly you acknowledge the impact of colonization on your characters while showing that their lives and histories and futures of the immortals conflicts are much larger and more complicated than the violence of the last 500 years. And they write, I'm curious if this is intentional and if you think about how much attention you want your books to pay to systemic oppression. And then do you have any advice for avoiding or dodging the familiar narratives that others may want to push on your work? And then they say, sorry for the long question. I love Trickster number 3, which they just finished.
It's a very careful balance. There needs to be some context, but strictly for the story, for the purpose of the story, some of the elements are helpful to know, but going into any great detail in this particular story would not be helpful. There's a lot of explanation, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of characters, because there's so much complexity between all the moving parts. Adding in like a history lesson would just be, too much. That would be, it would really bring the novel to a crawl. So I would say it really depends on the story that you're telling, the intention that you have. I know that with other novels, for instance, if you're exploring the impacts of the residential schools, you're going to need to do like a lot more scenes that explain like the basis of that trauma. Or if you're telling a story like if you're going the murder mystery route, then you would need a lot less than I've given. Like you just need to set up it. So the answer, I guess, would be it really depends on what you're writing. If the story will shape the information that you need to give to your readers. Yeah, in essays, I've been more blunt, but because most of my early mentors were social realists, the constraints of social realism are that you let the world show the reader, the important information. And I have since drifted a little away from social realism. As you can tell from the organ roundup in the hospital bathroom. But my writing is still influenced by the way they approach the material. So I think that was that?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's also a question from Connie. What was your reason for trap lines? I loved this read, and after every story ended, I found I wanted to know the rest of the story and wanted to know more. Was there real facts behind these?
these, like the actual story Traplines was the very first story that came together for me. And it came together so easily, it came together effortlessly. And that was my original approach to writing. Like I wanted to Margaret Lawrence my world so that it would be very, so that I wouldn't have to deal with the fallout of having it set in a real place. Um, and there were a number of like factors that changed that later. But so that was the first story, and the second story. Um, which one was that? I think that was inspired by an interview I had heard on NPR with the Unabomber's brother.
Oh.
He was the one who turned in the Unabomber, and
Mhm.
he was feeling intense guilt. Um, he said that when he heard the letter read out, he knew it was his brother, but he also knew what it would do to his family and to his brother, if he turned him in. Uh, but he realized that people were dying, and this was a really grim situation. So that interview haunted me, and I wondered what it would be like to be in a family where you knew your family member had done something horrific. Like, what would you do?
Mhm.
That was actually the story that Mom found the most disturbing, because the mother is a serial killer, and she keeps the bodies in freezers in the basement. And Mom at the time had like 3 freezers in the basement, and she would she would bring people to the basement and show them that there were no bodies.
I was just gonna ask, did you have to prove to people?
Well,
Not true.
he felt the need to prove to people that she wasn't a serial killer, and I was like, no one thinks you're a serial killer, Mom. It's just it's fiction. It's something I made up. And the third story in Traplines was a novella that was contact sports, and that was my apprentice piece for novels. Like that was my big step between short stories and novels. That was the longest breath I've ever taken. And it was like a cat and mouse game between two cousins. One of them is a budding sociopath. Well, he's more psychopath. He's more of a psychopath, I should say. Um, and it, you know, I really that was like at the time I was fascinated with serial killers, and I was being an emo goth. That's the kind of material that interested me. So it was um yeah, it was, that was where I learned, like um like I wrote it in first person, I wrote it in third person, I spent a couple of pages writing it in second person. I wrote it in past tense, present tense. I switched the genders of all the characters. So everything, all the skills that I needed to write a novel, I learned in that. So that is still like my favorite piece of writing, just because of it took about 10 years to write. It's only 100
Mhm.
pages, um, but I but that's where I learned the most. And then the final novel in the collection was Queen of the North. Originally, like that manuscript was my thesis, and the original ending story was Terminal Avenue, which was my sci-fi bondage response to Oka. I think if it had come out after 50 Shades, they might have kept it in.
Mhm.
But all the editors said that it didn't fit the tone of the collection, so they asked me if I had anything else. So I pulled out uh, Queen of the North, and at that point, Karaoke was going to be the narrator of Monkey Beach. So this was a story that was the genesis of Monkey Beach. But after the events of Queen of the North, she didn't want karaoke didn't want to narrate anymore. So then I had to find a different narrator, and it turned out to be like a very minor character that's like mentioned in 2 sentences, Lisa. So that, and yeah, I wrote trap lines throughout my bachelor's, but mostly during my master's. And Monkey Beach was like the early versions of Monkey Beach were workshopped quite heavily. And because I had successfully finished the novella, I, thought that it would be easily transferable to a novel, and, told everybody that I would be done my novel in a year. And
Famous last words.
5 years later, novels are quite different beasts from novellas. They're structurally quite intense.
So I think we have time for one more question, if that's okay.
Okay.
So this is from Rachel. Which of your characters has surprised you the most throughout the series, and why? And she also wrote, "Thank you for your incredible stories."
Oh, thank you. Well, Maggie has definitely been the most surprising. Like she was supposed to be a walk-on character. She was just there to show you, you know, the kind of environment Jared had grown up in. But they turned out to have such a tender relationship. So underneath the banter, underneath the arguing, underneath like all the drama they had in their life, they really had a strong bond, and it proved to be pretty well unbreakable throughout the series. So even when she was off stage in book 2, she was still a presence, and I really loved the way that they got along, and the way that they didn't get along, and the way they bounced off each other and drove each other nuts. That amused me. So in the 3rd novel, things only shift because Jared starts to view Maggie as another human being, not just his mother, but someone with a backstory, and who's lived a very full life before she had him. And because his reaction to her shifted, her reaction to him shifts, and they start to view each other uh, in a more adult relationship. And that was just one of the most amazing moments of writing. It was just that, watching their relationship evolve over the 3 books. That was my favorite moment.
Thank you so much, Eden. I know that we all really appreciate it and taking the time out to come talk to us. We all wish it could be in person. Maybe.
Yeah. 2024.
There you go. Wishful thinking. But we really appreciate it, and thank you again, and thanks for everybody for attending tonight as well.
Oh, thank you so much for hosting me. This has been lovely.
Thanks, Eden. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.